In our OpenHPI course, Confidential Communication in the Internet, now we want to consider public key infrastructures in more detail. We already discussed about and mentioned the name public key infrastructure when we discussed the trust problem for asymmetric crypto protocols and certificates. The public key infrastructures are the idea, the best working idea for solving the trust problem of the asymmetric crypto protocols. The idea is to use an independent, trustworthy authority called a trust center, which certifies the binding of a public key to a certain person. So, digitally signed binding of a user, his name and his public key and some additional information is called a certificate. More precisely, it's a key certificate because there exist different certificates. So it gives a kind of passport for the user in such a public key infrastructure to explain to other users, this is my name and this is my public key. So the certificates are used to ensure that the exchange of information is legally binding, that it's not possible for Mallory to fake the public key of Bob by replacing it with its own. And in this way, the identity of the users are ensured in such a public key infrastructure. And of course, it is important that this trust center, which issues such certificate, is trustworthy and is an independent. So the participants only have to trust the trust center, then they can trust the certificates. If you are interested in more details here to the topic of such a trust center and public key infrastructures, there is another OpenHPI workshop on digital identities where we have to discuss this in detail. So the certificate is simply a document which is signed by this trust center, which is signed by this trustworthy third party, and it attests the connection between a person or an entity and its public key. And if one trusts the trust center, one can, which have signed the certificate, then one can trust also the certificate of this trust vendor. So these certificates are needed to contain the following information: the owner of the certificate, it could be a person, but also a company or a web server, the public key of the owner, and then the third most important information on the certificate is the digital signature of the trust center that issued the certificate. So trust center guarantees the accuracy of these information. This is exactly the need of such trust centers and how we provide a solution to the trust problem of asymmetric encryption protocols. Now, to solve the trust problem by means of certificates, a complete infrastructure, the so-called public key infrastructure, is required. And the task of this public key infrastructure is the certificate management. The certificate management consists in the specification and the enforcement of a security policy, a set of rules where it is exactly explained who can get a certificate, how one can get a certificate, what are the regulations, how this trust center is working. Then a task of this public key infrastructure of the trust center is to create a certificate, to manage the certificates, to revoke digital certificates if it is necessary. And to this end, the public key infrastructure includes some software components, some hardware components, as well as stuff to manage this certificate management task. So the interaction of the individual components of a trust center, PKI, to solve these tasks is ruled by a certificate management protocol. Let's have a closer look. At the center of such a public key infrastructure is the trust center. The trust center has the following components: a certification authority, a registration authority, and a validation authority. And here in the picture, we will later on see it, you see the different components. Typically, all together is called trust center. Let's have a closer look first on the certification authority, CA. The certification authority is the most important component of a trust center. For that reason, often it is used synonymously for the trust center. When we discussed about the hierarchical trust model, use sources, we spoke about CAs when we meant a trust center. The certification authority generates certificates. This is the task. So it receives all the information that is necessary for the certificate. The information is the name of the user, its public key, and other information. It generates the certificates, and then it signs the certificates. This is important so that everyone sees the certification stands for this binding of the name and the public key. The certification authority is a very security critical component of a trust center. If the private key of a CA got into the hand of cyber criminals, the entire PKI is worthless. Why? Because the private key is needed for the certification authority to digital sign the certificates. And if cyber criminals can hold this private key in their hand, then they can issue certificates as they like. In many countries there are signature acts, legal regulations, and these signature acts, which are mostly introduced to define the requirements to digital signatures, these signature acts require high demands on the security of a certification authority before it is allowed to issue certificates for legally binding so-called qualified digital signatures. So the digital signature that it is recognized in the legal system. Before it is recognized in the legal system, it's a lot of requirement to fulfill concerning such certification authority. Besides of the registration authorities, Trust Center has the component of a registration authority. And the registration authority is a registration office for applying for a digital certificate for the participants of a public key infrastructure. The registration authority can be implemented centralized in a trust center, but it can also operate decentralized with many offices in a region. The RA, the registration authority, collects all the necessary data for the creation of a digital certificate, and then it transfers this data to the certification authority. The type of interaction and verification, personal registration, or whether I only have to send an email, registration via the internet. So the exact description is important because this describes the security level of the PKI. If I can register by a simple email, then the security standard of such a PKI is very low. If I have to personally show my passport to the registration authority, then of course it is a high level of a security level, because this is a point where the identity of the user is checked. There are standards, so in this PKI standard, the PKI-X standard, it does not prescribe such a registration authority, However, the public key infrastructures implemented in practice generally does not allow direct communication between the user and the certification authority to improve the security and to protect the certification authority. And then a third component is the validation authority. Validation authority checks the certificate against the stored information and confirms whether certificate is valid or is no more valid. Once the certificate is validated, the client can further verify the corresponding digital signature itself and can work and can trustfully communicate. The communication with the trust center is, of course, in real time, and it's also signed, because it's not enough when such a validation authority gives next day an answer, yes, this is a valid certificate, while the certification authority already disputed this certification. Also, the simultaneous verification of several certificates is possible by such validation authorities. I already mentioned the public key infrastructure can also have some decentralized components. So in addition to the trust center, a PKI includes the following components which can, and some of them must be, operated decentralized. There are the local registration authorities, there are the revocation authority, and a personal security environment for the participants of such a public key infrastructure. Let's first look at the local registration authorities. They take over the task from the central registration authority to identify the user. So if the user are requested to come personally to the registration office, okay, it's not possible to ask them to travel to one central point. So not all users can verify themselves in person at a central registration authority. Therefore, multiple such local registration tasks are possible and are available and can do the task. The local registration authority can be located, can be operated by fitting places, can also be operated by companies, for example, telecommunication provider, universities, technologies, companies, and others. Very important for public key infrastructures are the revocation of unvalid certificates, and this is done by such a revocation authority. The revocation authority is responsible for the deletion, the revocation of a certificate. Remember, that's not easy, because all the participants can have stored certificates from other participants when they want to send them information. So there need to be, in the security policies, described a way how invalid certificates can be deleted. When it's possible, when it's necessary to remove a certificate, then remove a certificate, it's not enough simply to delete it, as it is still signed and malicious people could still abuse it. So the trust of a certification authority to the particular certificates has to be removed. But one cannot take the certificate which was sent out with the signature of a CA, they are out. So it's a little bit tricky. So here the idea to implement such a deletion of certificates is to do this by a so-called certificate revocation process. Revocations are necessary in different situations. For example, when the private key of a user got compromised, then his certificate, which assigns the corresponding public key, is no more valid. If the private key is lost or stolen, the certificate needs to be revoked. If the information connected to the certificate has changed, for example, if the user has changed his or her name, the URL of a service has changed, then of course the certificate needs to be changed, and then if the certificate has expired. Third decentralized component is the personal security environment for the user. This is also part of the infrastructure which guarantees that asymmetric encryption methods and digital signature protocols can be securely applied. So a successful use of these asymmetric crypto systems and protocols is based on the security of the private key. This is the A and O of all this working and all this functionality of this asymmetric crypto systems. If the private key is not kept secret, the identity of the owner can be misused. If an attacker can get the private key of a user in its hand, then the attacker can sign documents, digital sign documents in the name of the user. And of course, this should not be happen. Therefore, private certificates and keys should be kept in a so-called personal security environment. And as the private key should not leave, and one should organize all the work with the asymmetric cryptographic protocols in a way that this private key should never leave this personal security environment. So one has to remind what one has to do with the private key. So first, the private key needs to be generated. So the private key should be generated in such a personal security environment. Then cybertext should be decrypted with a private key. So this should be done in this personal security environment because private key is needed for this description. And then for the signature of documents, this was the encryption with a private key. Also, this should be done in this personal environment. If we look to practical realizations of such personal security environments, then I will mention an example with a software key. It is a simple security environment which can be provided on PCs. And the idea is to, on the PC's hardware, to allocate some space. The access to the space is protected by a password. This is managed with a special software, and the security depends, of course, on the operating system of the PC, and so that attacker cannot get access in another way to the hard disk and to areas in the hard disk. And the security of this personal security environment depends from the strength of the password. Otherwise, with a simple password attack, the attacker can get access to the private key of a user. Another example is so-called hardware key. This is a secure environment on a smart card. So smart card is a separate computer, a small computer, simple computer, which stores user private key and which stores the signed certificate. The advantage of this approach is the card can easily be carried along, so one can have his personal security environment in any place. only few accesses manipulations are possible. Via a card reader, only few accessible possibilities of the manipulations of the smart card are possible. The only way is via the card reader, and the card readers only provide very simple functionality. And then the access to the key is not possible or is very difficult for the hackers. Disadvantage here is that the calculations, the encryption and the decryptions need to be done on the chip of the smart card. Of course, this is compared to a real computer, only a computer with less power, so often this is difficult. The solution here is to only encrypt session keys or document hashes, this short information on the card, on the smart card, and to use for the other computations a computer. So these are public infrastructures which are applied in the internet. We will have a closer look to this, and which provide a very secure frame for working with asymmetric encryption protocols, which allows digital signatures for documents, which allows very secure communication, confidential communication in the internet.